So what he does in chapter 3 is he sort of tries to go back in history, and he's, deja vu all over again, if you will, right? This sort of idea that what's happened in history is now beginning to happen again. And he starts with an interesting quote from John Maynard Keynes. But most important of all, he regarded the state of affairs as normal, certain and permanent, except in the direction of future improvement, and any deviation from this improvement, as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. So basically, and Keynes is writing about the same thing, right? I mean, if you back us up 10, 15 years ago, the idea is that prosperity is simply going to go on forever. And we're sort of in this continuous prosperous time, and the human society is just going to get better and better and better and better and better. And that, yeah, well, all right, there'll be little bumps in the road, but these are avoidable, and they're scandalous, right? The problem is it's because people who should have known better didn't do what they should have done, right? And we should fix this, and we can fix this. And so we're in the same position now, as this is coming to an end, as they were in 1912, before the outbreak of the First World War. And then he gets into, and this is an important term, if you will, and you could read a lot more into this chapter than this, but I really want us to really get this idea of paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift is a very scientific word, right? And as he talks about in the book, it describes this process of how old science, old sort of paradigms or ways of thinking are thrown off, and new ways of thinking are brought into the norm. And the process of a paradigm shift, we sort of start in a stable state and we end in some new stable state, right? And if you sort of looked at those two times in isolation, you say, well, that was nice, right? We went from some state and they found it wasn't working anymore, or it was rejected, or all of those kinds of things, and it went somewhere new. And very often when we look back, if we look back with enough history, right, or with enough distance, we can say, well, that was good. But all transitions are essentially chaotic, right? Throwing out a paradigm, making a paradigm shift, particularly now that paradigm shift is socioeconomic, right, or political economic, that we're seeing movement from globalization to multipolar, is chaos in a sense when you're living through that transition. And maybe now that's where we are. We're living through this transition from globalization to a multipolar world. And so I think O'Sullivan's end arguments are that it's not necessarily that a multipolar world is bad, and it's not that we can't prosper in it. We can prosper in this world, but that it's not right now, right? Not during the transition. It's messy, and how we navigate that as a society, like as Canadians, right? How we will navigate that, maybe even more particularly as people from Alberta, right? I think perhaps no one in the developed world is in the thick of it, of this transition as we are. We've seen the total collapse of our main industry and energy. How that comes back, we don't know. And so this is quite important, right? And so it's going to be messy for a while. And as business people, we don't create the political economy, if you will. We function in the political economy. And so we have to understand what this transition is, and we have to try to navigate our way through it. So this is a difficult period, he argues in the book. And so his argument is that globalization is being rejected and a paradigm shift is underway. And he kind of divides this up into saying, okay, fine. There's a lot of people who are rejecting globalization for quite good reasons. So you reviewed the globalization debate, and you could see why there's a group of people who are quite happy about all of this, right? If you listen to the globalization debate, and even more so today, right? As as people are being more affected by it. And that there's sort of consequences even beyond the economic ones that we looked at in the review. And so, and this is rational in that sense. But it's also, I think, what he is arguing here is being hijacked, by the likes of sort of right wing, mostly, and to some degrees left wing politicians, who are sort of hijacking this, because you can get a lot of political currency out of this, right? It's somebody else's fault. It's structural. If we just fix the structures, we'll be all good to go, and I'm the person who can do it. And there's all kinds of mileage that can be gotten out of this. And nobody likes elites, right? Nobody likes the super rich people anyways, or those who control. And we invent all kinds of interesting stories about these people. And so there's a lot of political mileage that can be gotten out of this. And I think what's really interesting is that when you looked at my review lessons that I gave you, that I made some time ago, the globalization of markets and production and all those kinds of things. It's not that we have to say that that's not some of the truths are not still in there, but I think we're seeing considerable fractures in global trade, and we're going to see more and more of them. If you think that if the Americans choose a different president next time, that's going to change this trajectory, I think that's optimistic. I think that's not what's happening. I think we're going to see more and more, both on the so-called left and right, because in a sense, the left and right agree on these things, right? They agree that that somehow globalization has failed. They may agree with it for different reasons, and their remedies might be different, and their motivations might be different. But I think ultimately this is going to play out. This idea of world diplomacy is going to decrease. And another reason I think he says in the book, right, world diplomacy is going to sort of go on a retreat because there's other countries that are essentially have enough power, if you will, that they don't have to sort of be, shall we say, supplicant to the United States or to Western countries. And he sort of says this is deja vu, right? And I think maybe he overplays this. Though certainly the world has never been, and with technology that we have, the world has never been as interconnected as it is now. So it's kind of a little critique I'll give right away to the book. And we can explore that a lot more in depth. But he's right in a sense that there was this sort of wave of globalization that ended in 1912, prior to the beginning of the First World War, and then it essentially picked up somewhat again in the 20s, only to be sort of crushed during the 1930s. And then with the end of the World War, started a movement towards the Second World War, started this movement again towards globalization. And we've seen sort of a 50 to 70 year progression of globalization, which he now thinks is at a close. But here's the thing, and he argues in the book as well, is that this kind of notion of globalization as being alive and well is certainly advantageous. It's advantageous to a large group of people, sort of the globalists, guys like me, to hope that there's sort of a belief that globalization might continue to exist. And elites are sort of still promoting it. And his argument is that's because it's in their best interest, but it's sort of a last gasp, if you will, at globalization. And then several times throughout the book, he sort of says, okay, what is this multipolar world look like? And so I'll bring it out now. He sees it as 3 to perhaps 4 regions. There's this China-centric Asia. And this is really interesting. Because I do know Asia somewhat, and the exclusion of Japan is very important here. And where Japan, and he mentions this in the book, you'll see it in the book, and that makes total sense to me. Where Japan fits in all of this is really different. Japan is still the world's 3rd largest economy, and Japan is different than Asia, the rest of Asia, in many really, really profound ways that you'd only it takes you a long time of living in Asia to realize that. It's a lot to do with their former empire and sort of the collapse of that, but even a very, very long sort of centuries of history. Japan is an island, and as an island has always sort of been somewhat a different Asia than the rest of Asia. So that's important to remember. But so what he's talking about is this more China-centric Asia, which will include a lot more of Southeast Asia in with China, and even countries like Singapore and South Korea. And those countries together he feels, will form this kind of region. And we certainly see that coming. We certainly see that a lot more trade is going on between China and South Korea, two very large economies there. And a lot of that trade is now going on not in US dollars. So prices are not being set in US dollars. Prices are being set in Chinese RMB, Chinese yuan. And that's a substantive shift, because back up only 15, 20 years ago, and prices between Korean and any other Asian country doing business were set in US dollars, right? And so the movement away from that is quite profound. And so he's talking about that as one pole, as he calls them. And then sort of the Europe, or the Eurasia world, that he talks about. And he says, so Europe, we can think about the European Union without Britain now. It's sort of the sort of post-Brexit Europe. And then he looks at the sort of Anglosphere, led, of course, by the United States. But, that's the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom and Australia sort of forming that Anglosphere of influence. And once again, those things move too. Like, where does Australia going to fit? Is Australia going to fit into a China-centric pole, maybe in terms of trade, but maybe not in terms of political economy? And so these are issues that he only sort of gets at the book. And I think we'll need to, as in this class, we'll need to dig a little more deeper into some of that. And then he sort of talks about the possibility of this kind of Dubai to India pole. And that's important. Where India is going to fit into the world is an open question. India is the world's largest democracy, and it functions, an incredibly highly functional democracy with incredible economic growth. But India's still has so many problems and so many issues to work out internally. It'll be interesting to see what happens to India. So he's right to sort of put a sort of question mark around India and a question mark around Russia. So you can sort of look at that when we go through the book. How would you divide up these poles? What do you think the way he's divided up these poles? And I think that's an open question. To me, I found when I was reading the book that that's certainly one thing about this book that is not like sort of textbooky, if you will. He redefines it as he goes through, and so for him it must be an open question, I think, as well. And so that's going to be important for us maybe to work through in our discussions. So before we go on to the next chapter, another chunk I found in the video on the internet with Michael O'Sullivan is how he answers the question, how will globalization change? So let's listen to his answer to this question.
Globalization is changing. We're going to go through a period of 5 to 10 years which is going to be noisy and confusing until we find a kind of a structure to describe the next world order. And there's lots of routes down which the world can go. I think what people have to do is to focus on constructive ways of remaking finance, economic policy, geopolitics, etc. And much less to be caught up in the short-term news and really think about the future.
So in the next chapter of the book, he spends a little bit more time with this sort of the historical context around the levelers, this group of people he sort of based the book around. And it's a quote in here. For really, I think if the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live is the greatest he. And the quote there is basically liberty and democracy, right? And fairness and equality that should exist in a society. And I guess his argument throughout the entire book is that the end of globalization, when the paradigm shift is complete, and sort of when the world settles, is hopefully that in our sphere of control, we'll be at a more level society, a more equal society with more equality. That in fact that could be a positive outcome for us who choose it. To be living in this sort of non-globalized but rather multipolar world. So I won't spend too much time on this chapter, not because it's not important. It's a very important chapter, but only because I think as you read through this this chapter, I mean, Michael Sullivan does a really sort of wonderful job of sort of painting this picture for us, and I think we can leave that to him in this historical context. But only to say this sort of the book, if you will, sort of centers around these Putney debates, where the context here is the 17th century after the 30-year war ended, and Europe is in a total mess. And Britain had sort of been, or England had been sort of separated from this. And so now there's this kind of rising up against King Charles. And he's been taken prisoner. And the point being here is that a substantive group of common people sort of raised up in these Putney debates and brought forward what a level society would look like and called themselves levelers, right? Equal, all on the same level. And what they were asking for is not so different than what we're seeing from the so-called left nowadays, the social democrats. And you can see I put a picture up here of Bernie Sanders. They were asking for things, and most of this has come about by now, but things like term limits and an end to corruption and what was, of course, very substantive back before our modern bankruptcy laws is the sort of fair treatment of people before the debt courts. Now, I mean, our bankruptcy laws are so developed, but I mean, the fair treatment of people in debt now, and the amount of what are we going to do with all of these households that are in a kind of debt that seems impossible to get out of. And these are real issues. And I think that's why he sort of centers around them. I think they were really concerned with people sort of almost becoming slaves to the usury of debt like we're seeing nowadays. I think it's an issue now. I think it's sapping our productivity, our ability to grow, that households, so much of the income of so many households in this country and throughout the entire developed world, and now even the developing world, but less so, mostly the developed world. So much of our income is sapped by paying interest to moneylenders. Everybody from, good debt, if we will, on our reasonably priced mortgages, if we have one, all the way to incredibly bad debt. These credit card debts. I mean, 29% interest on a credit card debt is insane. And rational people seem to be sort of engaged in this, all the way up to what is criminal. Well, it's not necessarily criminal, but it maybe should be. I think what people are arguing is, this money lending, these money marks and those kind of payday loans type thing. And so we're sort of saddled with this debt that may make it impossible for us as a society to move forward. And I think that's the connection here. That's what I read in. That's why he's really sort of honed in on the levelers here. And I think what was really interesting is that he points out that the levelers failed. They didn't achieve political success in the moment, though many of their ideas eventually did. And so I think we see Bernie Sanders as the same exact character. Bernie Sanders has failed over and over again, it seems, to become president of the United States. But what kind of failure is that? Is his failure complete, or will his ideas raise up? His socially democratic ideas raise up. He's a leveler, if you will. When you're reading these levelers and you're trying to think, well, if you're really trying to wrap your head around, just picture Bernie Sanders, the sort of of old. And that's what we can take from this chapter for now. And so one final clip that I found from this interview with Michael O'Sullivan that I found on the internet is answers the question: are there other examples in time where this backlash to globalization has happened? And let's see how Michael O'Sullivan treats that question.
There are lots. I mean, if you take debt, for example, debt levels today are the highest they've been since the Second World War, and then going back to the Napoleonic Wars. And then that begs the question, what do you need to do to reduce debt levels? We can't grow out, inflation is too low, and I think there's going to have to be some kind of big debt restructuring. Also, against the big span of history, central banks are too powerful. They play too big a role in the world economy, and they have, I think, to recognize that QE has gone too far, and that's not the solution to many of the world's economic and other political problems. And then you go right back in history to things like the end of the 30 Years' War, Treaty of Westphalia, which gave rise to the nation state. And that's the kind of thing at this level that's relevant today, because the notion of the state, the region, superpowers is really being tested.